This episode is brought to you by Sabio, the #1 coding bootcamp for veterans. Visit sabio.la/military to learn more. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
This is Military Matters. Over the last couple of seasons, we've spotlighted countries in our Future War series. That spotlight now moves to North Korea, a country shrouded in secrecy and led by a dictator who rules not only as a political leader, but as a god to his people. In this first of a two-part episode, Jack Murphy talks with a North Korea expert who takes us behind the DMZ into the history of this country, how it's evolved militarily, and why he likens the Kim family to a mafia crime family cult. Jack Murphy explains.
Welcome back to Military Matters. I'm Jack Murphy. Today, we are continuing our series of deep dives on various national security issues that America is confronted with around the world. We've interviewed many experts about Russia and China, but today I talked to Korea expert, retired Colonel David Maxwell. He is a former Special Forces officer who served extensively in Korea and the Philippines, and today is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. In our wide-ranging interview, we discussed the history of Korea, the scope of the Kim family regime in North Korea, why America continues to have 30,000 soldiers stationed in South Korea, and much more. So first, to kind of preface this discussion a little bit, I'd like to ask you about the history of Korea post-1945, the partition of the Korean Peninsula. And if you could talk a little bit about that and sort of what America's role has been in regards to Korea, the Korean Peninsula, since the conclusion of the Second World War.
Yeah, it's a great question. And of course, 1945, August 15th, the day World War II ended in Japan surrendered, is a liberation day for Korea. Korea had been occupied since 1910 by Japan. It had been colonized, and the Korean people, had suffered under this rule. And of course, Korea had been a homogeneous country, give or take, for about 5,000 years, according to Koreans. And they had three kingdoms and everything, but basically, homogeneous Korean people. And in 1945, one of the first major deception operations of the Cold War took place. And the reason for that was that the Soviet Union and forces were in the Soviet Far East, and U.S. forces, were in Japan. And it was obvious that the Soviet forces were going to be able to occupy the entire Korean Peninsula at the time before the U.S. could get there. So two lieutenant colonels working at the State Department, they came up with the idea that it should coordinate with the Soviet forces, and that the Soviet forces would take the surrender of the Japanese forces in the northern half of Korea and the U.S. forces in the southern half. And they, of course, looked at National Geographic magazine, saw the 38th parallel, and used that as the dividing line. And of course, that became the de facto division of the peninsula in 1945. And, the Soviets could have continued all the way to Busan and occupied it. We wouldn't have been able to stop them. So that action, which was really deceiving the Soviet Union, prevented communist occupation of all of Korea. But of course, it divided the peninsula. And in the period between 1945 and 1950, the UN, called for elections, called for stabilizing the Korean Peninsula, having Korean Peninsula. And of course, 1948 elections were held, and the North refused to participate in them. So elections were held in the South. Syngman Rhee was elected president, and we had the division of the peninsula. An interesting fact that is applicable today as we talk about security force assistance and the strategic necessity of that. During that period, there was a lot of, guerrilla warfare engagement north and south. We also were concerned about starting another war and of South Korea attacking the North. And so we deliberately helped develop a Korean military that did not have offensive maneuver capabilities. It was about a 50,000 man constabulary force to really defend against North Korean guerrilla attacks, subversion, and really maintain a strong police type presence to defend the country from from infiltration and internal attacks. And so we did not create a military that could defend South Korea. On the other hand, the North, of course, had designs from the beginning. Kim Il-sung taking over the North and creating his myth that he was the great guerrilla leader. He commanded the first of the 88th Special Independent Sniper Brigade, which was under the Soviet Army. And his son Kim Jong-il was born in the Soviet Far East, not in North Korea, but he became this leader, and of course, like Syngman Rhee, wanted to unify the peninsula and was willing to use force. In 1949, the Chinese Civil War ended, and Mao Zedong, established the PRC. About 100,000 ethnic Koreans had been fighting with the Chinese forces, and they returned back to North Korea. And they were battle-hardened troops, 100,000. And of course, Stalin provided military support to North Korea, particularly in the form of T-34 tanks. And so by 1950, you had a pretty formidable North Korean People's Army, armed with tanks and artillery, fairly well trained from recent combat actions in China, facing a 50,000 man constabulary force, lightly armed, no armored vehicles, mortars, and just a few howitzers, not any kind of heavy artillery. And of course, in January 1950, Dean Acheson made his famous speech and talked about U.S. interests in the Far East and drew the line at Japan. And so Korea was not included in the U.S. sphere of influence. And so that gave subtle justification, certainly to Kim Il-sung, but in his maneuverings with Mao and Stalin, who he played off both against each other, gave him rationale to attack the South, and really they gave permission to do that. And of course, like all military leaders, like Putin's war today, he said it would be over quickly. They would win, and it wouldn't cost an exorbitant amount. So by May of 1950, the up until that point, there had been a tremendous amount of propaganda, rhetoric, and of course, guerrilla and subversive actions. But that ceased in May. And analysts thought, well, North Korea is ready to negotiate, ready to talk. And they had talked about having a meeting in Kaesong, which at the time was still in South Korea, because that was below the 38th parallel. It's, of course, in North Korea now. But there was discussion about having talks. And so that kind of lulled everyone into a sense of complacency. But of course, all warfare is based on deception. And you can't really trust the communists. And by June 24th, North Korea was ready to attack. And of course, they chose that date because that was the date that the ROK Army Officers Club opened in Seoul. And all the leadership of the ROK Army was at the grand opening. And of course, they attacked on the morning of June 25th. And, and all the leadership was there. And of course, one of the national heroes of South Korea, who just passed away 2 years ago, General Paek Sun-yup, he was commanding, 29-year-old division commander, commanding the 1st Division. The Kaesong Moonsan approached the main division. And of course, once the word came that North Korea had attacked, he got his driver, jumped in his Jeep, and in his dress uniform, drove to the front. And for the next 5 days, he led the division's withdrawal. And of course, he had the 7th Division to the right. And to hear him tell the story, if they had been able to hold at Uijeonbu, he claims he would have been able to defend Seoul. But the right gave, and he had to withdraw. And soon after met General MacArthur at Suwon Air Base. And of course, by then, we had maneuvered the UN Security Council to institute and pass UN Security Council Resolution 83, 84, and 85 because the Soviet Union was in fact boycotting the UN Security Council, and they weren't there to veto it. And so we were passed those resolutions, which of course called on free nations of the world to defend the freedom of South Korea, established North Korea as the belligerent, as the attacker, the hostile force, but it called on nations to defend freedom in South Korea, established the United Nations Command, which continues to exist today, and it made the United States the executive agent of the United Nations Command. And so the United Nations commander actually answers to the U.S. chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who provides an annual report to the United Nations. So even though there's a United Nations command, that commander is not reporting directly to the United Nations. We are the executive agent, and that continues in existence today. And until 1978, the United Nations Command had operational control of all the forces, ROK and U.S. forces in Korea for the defense of Korea. And that changed in 1978 when the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command was established, which is a bilateral command, and it is a command that is co-owned or equally owned by both countries. It answers to what's called the Military Committee, which we say is made up of representatives of the National Command Authority. And in Korea, we call it the National Command and Military Authorities, which is made up of both chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Korean Minister of Defense, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, the commander of Indo-PACOM, and the senior U.S. military officer in Korea. And the senior U.S. military officer in Korea and the ROK chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are the permanent members of the committee. And they provide oversight and strategic guidance of the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. And I mention that because a lot of people think that the U.S. controls Korean forces. That's not the case. It is the Combined Forces Command, and the ROK military is a force provider to the Combined Forces Command, just as U.S. Forces Korea is a force provider. U.S. Forces Korea is actually a subunified command of Indo-PACOM, and it's the U.S. Joint Force in Korea. It is not the warfighting force. The warfighting force is the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command, and it is that command that has the mission of deterrence of North Korean attack and defense against North Korean attack. And so that's very important. The United Nations Command, which still exists, is responsible for enforcing the armistice agreement, managing and investigating actions on the demilitarized zone that happened between North and South. And it will be a force provider if hostilities resume, meaning the sending states, the original 16 nations, and now there are others that commit to the defense of South Korea, they will commit forces to Korea. And the commander of the United Nations Command will then, based on a request from the commander of the Combined Forces Command, he will provide forces for tactical employment under the Combined Forces Command. So the UN Command will not command a warfight. It will be the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command. But the UN Command will be able to provide the right forces because, as you know, countries will send forces with national caveats. You know, some forces will not be able to go north of the DMZ. Some can only for defense. You know, and others like the UK and Australia and many of the NATO countries will be able to be used pretty much any way necessary to win the war. So every country has national caveats, and the UN commander will ensure that the forces that are needed by the Combined Forces Command will be the ones that are able to operate in accordance with the demands of the warfight.
Yeah, it was interesting doing some research on this stuff about SOC Corps and how those commands exist, and then how they change during wartime to become this sort of joint unconventional warfare command. It was just fascinating to hear about that.
Yeah, so that's what's really unique about. So you have a permanent Combined Forces Command of ROK and U.S. staff. You also have a permanent Combined Air Forces Component Command. ROK in U.S., which is really critical. I mean, air power is critical to the defense of Korea. And so those are permanently established commands. Other commands, that the Marines, the Navy, and the Special Operations Command, there are U.S. components, and of course there are ROK components. When the decision is made to fully activate Combined Forces Command and provide forces to the Combined Forces Command, these other component commands will stand up, these combined component commands. So now it's no longer the Combined Unconventional Warfare Task Force, it's now the Combined Special Operations Component Command in Korea.
And part of that contingency plan is also to receive follow-on American forces that would be landing on the peninsula in the event of a North Korean invasion. And they would provide these sorts of liaison services to get them to the commands and the positions on the front lines that they need to be at.
That's exactly right. And that's often overlooked. The U.S. forces are really, there's only 28,500 on the peninsula. And the combat forces are actually relatively small. The 2nd Infantry Division only has one ground combat brigade that is a rotational brigade. It has a fires brigade, which is fully integrated with the ROK artillery and fires for what we call the counterfire fight. Because North Korea, we often say, is an artillery army supported by a scheme of maneuver. They have massive amounts of artillery that range the frontline areas, artillery, rockets, and missiles. Which will have devastating effect. And so that counterfire fight is really critical. It takes our fires brigade, all the ROK artillery, as well as the air component, particularly the A-10s, that will have devastating effects on any exposed North Korean artillery. But the point is that there are very little ground combat forces. And then there are 2 air wings in the 7th Air Force. They're F-16s for the U.S., And so the forces that are existing are really there to optimize the Combined Forces Command with intelligence, communications, and really C4I, command control, communications, intelligence, and logistics, sustainment. And which gets to the point that you're making, is those forces are there for RSOI, reception, staging, onward movement, and integration into the fight. And so just to give you a scale of size, there's 650,000 ROK soldiers on active duty today. When they fully mobilize, there will be more than 3 million ROK soldiers. It's much different than 1950 when the ROK Army was very small and ended up being chopped by Sigmund Rhee to MacArthur, under the United Nations command, which has a lot of historical baggage to it. And when the bulk of the forces were U.S. and the dominant fighting force was U.S. in 1950 to 53. Another interesting development from the Korean War, though, was that because the Korean military was so small, but they still, of course, had a lot of military age males, while they were trying to rebuild the ROK Army, they also used Korean men to form 2 organizations that exist today. One of them is the KATUSAs, the Korean augmentees to the U.S. Army. And dating back to the Korean War, they were trained in Japan by U.S. forces, and they were integrated into U.S. military units as replacements, as full replacements to U.S. military units. And then the Korean Service Corps, which we call the A-frame Army. These were Korean men who wore the A-frame backpacks and carried ammunition up hills, and resupplied U.S. forces, also conducted construction and other types of support activities for the UN command. And that Korean Service Corps continues to exist at all U.S. bases. So there is a Korean civilian workforce that provides logistical support to U.S. forces. And the KATUSAs continue today to integrate. When I was a company commander in Korea, I commanded the combat support company of the 506th Infantry. We had 160 soldiers, 30 of them were Koreans. And most of our TOW anti-tank gunners were Korean because they were there at the time for 24 months, and U.S. forces were there only 12 months. So actually our Korean soldiers, not only provided language and culture and area expertise, and they had training continuity and sustainment, and so they were some well-trained soldiers, and were important to our organization. One very interesting thing that has come out is that on July 27th of this year was the anniversary of the armistice, and was the unveiling and dedication of the new Korean War Memorial that had been refurbished, and here on the Mall in Washington, D.C. And as part of the refurbishment, they built a wall of remembrance, and every soldier killed in the Korean War, his name is on there as the Vietnam War Memorial. But what is really interesting is that it includes 7,000, almost 800 Korean soldiers, Katyusha soldiers. It is the only memorial in the United States that has foreign soldiers' names on it.
While we're on this topic, why don't we talk a little bit about the annual and semi-annual training exercises that take place, jointly between American and South Korean forces, and why do we continue to do these exercises? Why do they have a continued relevancy after we've been in Korea for, in some form for 70 years now?
Well, first of all, before we do that, I think it's important to understand North Korea and its objectives. And North Korea has really a three-phase strategy, which is first political warfare, trying to subvert South Korea, undermine South Korea, and their United Front Department, 225th Bureau, they infiltrate, develop opposition political parties, infiltrate the unions, and they try to wreak havoc in South Korea. In addition, they now use cyber and manipulate social media, things like that. There's that subversive aspect. They're also trying to subvert the ROK-US alliance, to drive a wedge in the ROK-US alliance. So that's part of its political warfare strategy. The second part is blackmail diplomacy. And again, this is the use of threats, increased tensions, and provocations to gain political and economic concessions. And this happens on a routine basis. And Kim Jong-un believes that he can use these provocations to get concessions from us. The main concession that he has been trying to get since 2017 and has failed to get is relief of sanctions. We really imposed the heaviest sanction regime in 2017, and he told his elite and the military leaders that he could play President Moon and President Trump and would get sanctions relief. And to their credit, Moon and Trump did not provide sanctions relief. And to this day, Yoon and Biden refuse to do so as well. Differences being President Yoon, after his meeting with President Biden in May, declared that North Korea is the main enemy of South Korea and that there will be no more appeasement of North Korea. Those statements really foretell what is happening right now and the changes in the peninsula. Even though both President Yoon and President Biden say they are willing to talk and negotiate with Kim Jong-un, anywhere, anytime, without preconditions, the North refuses to do so. But it is the third element of their strategy that is important, and that is the development of advanced warfighting capabilities, conventional and weapons of mass destruction as well, nuclear and missile. They've been pursuing their nuclear weapons since the 1950s, which people don't really realize. They're deathly afraid of U.S. air power. They're deathly afraid of what happened in the Korean War, and they believe they need nuclear weapons to deter an attack, and that the U.S. will not attack a nuclear-armed country. And that's why they have pursued nuclear weapons for so long. However, they're not just for deterrence. They are for offensive purposes. And North Korea has designs to dominate the Korean Peninsula. Its constitution, it is a revolutionary country. It has to complete the revolution to unite Korea and rid Korea of foreign forces. And so that's in its constitution. Those are in its party documents. That is what they're trying to do. The Eighth Party Congress in January 2021 really emphasized this. And so they have conducted planning and preparations to fight a war. Now, the development of these warfighting capabilities also supports political warfare and blackmail diplomacy. So these three strategies are really interrelated, mutually supporting and reinforcing. And so we have to understand the nature of the regime. It's a rogue revolutionary power that seeks to dominate the Korean Peninsula under the rule of what I like to call the guerrilla dynasty and gulag state of North Korea, and which is what everybody keys on. This is that it is about regime survival, not survival of the nation state, not survival of the people, but regime survival. But we have to understand that the regime, Kim Jong-un, believes that ultimately survival is dependent upon dominating the entire Korean Peninsula.
If you're considering a career in software engineering, I recommend checking out Sabio, a coding bootcamp and developer community that's trained veterans since 2013. In just 17 weeks of remote learning, you'll graduate ready to start a real, high-paying job. Sabio alumni are working at companies like Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. Sabio can kickstart your career in tech today. Visit sabio.la/military to learn how you can use your VA benefits to enroll. That's sabio.la/military. Check the show notes for the link.
You use the term the Kim family regime or the Kim family criminal regime, the sort of like mafia-like crime family or cult that runs North Korea. I want to ask why you use that term. What does it mean to you? And what does it say about the North Korean government?
Excellent. Well, the legitimacy of the regime and the myth of, the myth surrounding the regime is founded on anti-Japanese partisan warfare. As I mentioned, Kim Il-sung was a guerrilla leader, and they painted this, that he was the great guerrilla leader that liberated Korea. Of course, as the commander, he was mostly sick. He conducted one military operation as a commander. They attacked a Japanese police box on the Russian-Korean border and killed about 15 Japanese policemen. And that was the entire operation, extent of his operations. But they had built this myth that North Korea is a guerrilla dynasty. And so the regime, the Kim family regime, the core are made up of all the members of his guerrilla force and their descendants. That's the core of the regime. And they are, so everybody who is a direct descendant of those fighters and those who married in, and of course, that's, a fairly large number, but that's the core of the elite. And they are mafia-like and a crime family cult. The Juche ideology has really, it has the characteristics of a cult. And when you talk to escapees from the North, they will tell you that they worship Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un, and that Juche is like a religion. And of course, mafia-like crime family cult is that the regime exists on illicit activities around the world. It conducts, the reason we have new $100 bills is because North Korea is such a prolific counterfeiter. And our Treasury Department has worked so hard to try to prevent counterfeiting. Some officials will say often when they to determine something that's counterfeit, it actually they determine it when it looks better than an actual dollar, and so some humor to that, but it goes to illustrate how proficient the North is. But not only counterfeiting dollars, they counterfeit cigarettes, they counterfeit medicines, Viagra, and of course they traffic in methamphetamine around the world. And of course, they launder money. And now they're prolific cyber warriors, cryptocurrency hacking, stealing, from the ATM system of the Chilean banks.
I talked to a Secret Service agent who worked a big counterfeiting case, And he told me that the case he worked on, the whole thing kicked off because there was a woman in the Philippines, a bank teller, and she was counting off $100 bills. And she just felt like one was just off, like it didn't feel right. And even when she kept putting that bill through a machine to check for counterfeit bills, it kept saying that it was a real bill. But she had just handled so much currency, felt so much of it. She just singled that $100 bill out and was like, something's wrong here, and flagged it. And that ended up kicking off an entire Secret Service investigation that, eventually led them to North Korea as the counterfeiters.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, I mean, I think that also says the importance of the human element, is superior to the machine.
Right.
Trust your gut, and thankfully that bank teller did. So it thrives on these illicit activities. And what is a key point to understand as well is North Korea makes so much money from its illicit. I mean, billions of dollars. It makes enough money to buy food to feed the 25 million Koreans in the north. And Kim Jong-un makes the deliberate decision to use his resources to build nuclear weapons, missiles, and advanced warfighting capabilities, to the detriment of the population. And so, he is not concerned with the welfare of the Korean people, and they suffer because of his deliberate decision making. And of course, he uses the justification of the threat from the South and from the U.S. as why the Korean people must sacrifice. And they believe that they are sacrificing, that they must build this formidable army to remain. And just a quick anecdote: in the 1990s. The Economist magazine did a surreptitious survey within North Korea and asked regular Koreans, how many countries there are in the world. And they would answer there are 5 countries in the world. And it was, of course, Russia, China, the United States, Japan, and North Korea. And all the other countries were puppets of the other 4. That they were all colonies or, under the thumb of the other 4. And it is only North Korea that has been able to maintain independence and has been able to stand up to not just the United States, but Russia, China, and Japan as well. And, there's really no love between North Korea and China and North Korea and Russia. Although, in today's world, there is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And there is a tremendous amount of cooperation taking place between China, Russia, and North Korea, to the point where at least it appears that North Korean supplies, ammunition, artillery is going to be sold back to Russia. And, there's even talk first of construction workers going to Russian-occupied areas in the Donbass to help rebuild. But even there are reports that there's talk about sending North Korean troops there, and which would be pretty amazing to do. I think we have to be skeptical about all those reports, but I think it is certainly true that North Korea has supported Russia. It's recognized the Russian-occupied areas. It has provided, criticism of the United States and Ukraine, and it has been rewarded by Russia because Russia provided some amount of wheat to North Korea, which appears to be obvious payback for that diplomatic support. So the point is, Russia is a mafia-like crime family cult. It rules with an iron hand, and it dominates the 25 million Koreans in the north. And we have to understand it. The last point I want to make, though, is that its warfighting capabilities, while many of its conventional forces are declining, they're suffering from malnutrition. They've got obsolete equipment, but they continue to train to prepare for attack. They conduct a winter training cycle and a summer training cycle, which people rarely talk about. The reason we always we used to conduct Team Spirit in March, and now we conduct what's called Key Resolve and Full Legal in March, is because North Korea would conduct its winter training cycle from November to March. And March is the optimal time to attack the South. Coming off the winter, the ground is still hard. The South has not planted the rice paddies. And so the North Korean forces would train from individual level in November through, combined arms operations up through March, and they would bring their forces to the highest state of readiness. And so we always conducted Team Spirit then to reinforce the peninsula, conduct an exercise to be ready for an attack. And it really has served two purposes. One, to deter. North Korea will likely never attack into strength unless it has to. And the second thing is that because of the deployment in our exercises, North Korea would alert its forces, and we can gain a lot of intelligence assessments from how they alert their forces, how they go to defensive positions, and things like that. So that's why Team Spirit, which I participated in the last one in 1993, which we ended in a run-up to the agreed framework in 94, to support diplomacy. And that's a key point that we should talk about, using exercises as concessions, stopping our training in order to support diplomacy. And so to your question of why we conduct now Ulchi Freedom Shield in August and Key Resolve and Full Eagle in March is because you have to train. And I think every soldier knows that training is perishable. And I like to use the analogy that our military forces are like athletes, like professional athletes. You have to train. Football players, soccer players, golfers. Everybody must train for game day. And for the tournament. And if you don't train, your skills atrophy. And so that's why we conduct training.
So another thing I'd like to talk a little bit about is North Korea's apparent, quote unquote, erratic behavior, and how they use that erratic behavior as a strategy. Like they want to make us think that they're crazy or irrational, and that this is actually part of a negotiation strategy. I was wondering if you could kind of unpack that for us a little bit, Dave.
First, I don't think North Korea is, and the regime is irrational. I think they're very rational in terms of their nature and what they're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. I don't think they've been erratic at all. I think they, we listen to their propaganda and we often laugh at their propaganda, their over-the-top rhetoric. But within that propaganda, after we get done laughing about it, we can really read some real messages in there. And they often tell us exactly what they're going to do. They tell us their intent. And of course, on September 8th, they just said that they have legalized that they're a nuclear power and that they will use nuclear weapons preemptively. That's basically what they've said. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And this goes to the point that I've been trying to make for a long time, is that North Korea has developed its nuclear weapons not just for deterrence, but for actual warfighting. And so I'm convinced that if they decide to attack the South, that they will attack the 7 United Nations bases in Japan, which are critical to supporting the war effort in Korea. And they will attack Pusan, the port of Pusan, which is critical for the flow of all forces. It's the major port where forces flow into. They'll likely use chemical weapons on all the airfields to try to stop the generation of air power, air sorties, and so they will make that an integral part. I don't think North Korea looks at nuclear weapons or chemical weapons as the same kind of taboo that we do. It is another capability and a weapon to be employed. And I think that, our traditional nuclear doctrine, and for deterrence, I don't think holds true. That said, deterrence has worked for 7 decades. And the reason I think that deterrence has worked really comes from the highest ranking defector from North Korea, Wang Jung-yap, when he defected in 1997. And he said, of course, we had to ask him, Kim Il-sung and then Kim Jong-il had invested so much in their military. Why has North Korea not resumed hostilities to achieve its objectives? And he said, it's obvious. He said, the presence of American forces. And he said that they understood that they would not be able to defeat South Korea as long as South Korea has U.S. forces. And the second part of that said that they know that if they attack, that the U.S. will use nuclear weapons against North Korea. And so that says two things.
Mm.
That says our declaratory policy works, but it also tells us why they have been pursuing nuclear weapons for so long. And so, it really gives us an indication. So, to get to the point, why do we have U.S. forces on the Korean Peninsula? It is not to win the war. It is not that we're going to be the main fight in the war. It is to deter attack. And we want to deter, it is in our interest to prevent hostilities on the Korean Peninsula. And, this little peninsula is at the heart of, the geostrategic location. It is both a dagger pointed at Japan from the Asian mainland. Traditionally, it has been the bridge from Japan to the Asian mainland. It's some of the most fought over territory. But today you have South Korea as the 10th largest economy in the world, one of the largest chip makers in the world, largest producers of technology, largest shipbuilder in the world, exporter of the Korean wave, culture and the like.
Yeah, the tiger of Asia, right? I remember talking to people who were stationed in Korea in the 1960s, and I believe they were telling me there wasn't even a paved road between Busan and Seoul at the time. Pictures that they shared with me of farmers, they'd get their hogs drunk on soju so that it would be more docile and tie it to the back of a bicycle and drive it to the market. The peninsula has just, particularly South Korea, has just made incredible progress over the last 50 years or so in modernization. And that modernization, it's also a thorn in the side for North Korea because it shows that democracy can work for the Korean people.
That's a whole nother point to talk about information, the existential threat of information to the regime. But South Korea, the key point though to make is it is also at the nexus of two major nuclear powers, China and Russia, and a rogue nuclear power of North Korea. The second and third largest economies, China and Japan, and of course the relations with the U.S. And so what happens on the Korean Peninsula is going to have global effects. And even if we were to remove U.S. troops, even if we were to not support South Korea, when a war happens, we will be affected here at home. There is no doubt that it will affect us. And so the 28,500 troops, are a lot on one hand, but it's also a relatively small investment to prevent war. Mm-hmm. And that is really the key to understanding, because even though I believe that the South Korean military would prevail in a war against North Korea, it is able to generate the forces, trained and ready forces. It'll be terribly bloody, and the peninsula will be destroyed. But I think South Korea will prevail without the U.S. But North Korea doesn't believe that. North Korea believes it will prevail against mm-hmm. South Korea without the U.S. And so it is the U.S. presence that's really the key to deterrence, and that's why we really need to maintain our presence on the peninsula.
The point I was trying to make with the comment about the Kim family seeming erratic is that it's like they're creating a provocation, and that it's a negotiation strategy, that they ratchet things up right all the way up to the breaking point, just about. And that allows them to negotiate for better concessions from the West, be it food or whatever it is they're looking for at the moment.
That's right. And they've been very successful. And that's really key to, they assess that their strategy works. And, we rarely respond with any kind of forceful action. The last time we responded with any kind of force was in 1976, the Axe murders, when Captain Boniface and Lieutenant Barrett were brutally murdered. And we conducted Operation Paul Bunyan, which was the largest show of force, in the region since the Korean War.
What Dave Maxwell is referring to is an incident in 1976 when two U.S. Army officers, First Lieutenant Mark Barrett and Captain Arthur Boniface, were a part of a detail tasked with cutting down a tree in the joint security area of the Korean demilitarized zone. After a confrontation with North Korean soldiers, the two officers were attacked and murdered by more than 20 North Korean soldiers with crowbars and clubs. In order to make a point, the Americans staged a show of force operation that was called Operation Paul Bunyan, in which they went in there and finally cut down that tree once and for all.
Two carrier battle groups, B-52s in the air, entire battalion in helicopters hovering, and then the entire division on alert, and then a South Korean battalion of engineers supported by a battalion of South Korean Special Forces, went in with axe handles and cut down the tree. And I mean, it was a huge show of force, and North Korea backed down, which is important to remember. North Korea will back down if you show strength and resolve. But often we hamstring ourselves, for political considerations. We don't want to appear provocative because of China in the region. South Korea doesn't want to get, drawn into a conflict. But I think it's important to remember that we have to demonstrate strength and resolve in the face of North Korean malign behavior. And it's really, really important that we do that, and not allow them to be successful in their political warfare strategy. And once you make concession, once you give in, then Kim Jong-un judges his strategy a success, and he will double down and continue to do it. And that's why you have this continued cycle of provocations where they're able to use this blackmail diplomacy to be able to extort concessions from us.
We're not done yet with North Korea. Next week, we'll be dropping part 2 of this interview with retired Special Forces Colonel Dave Maxwell as we explore the modern state of North Korea, the rocky relationship it's had with the U.S., and how do the South Koreans view the hostilities between the U.S. and North Korea. All that and more next week. Be sure to check us out on social media. We're on Twitter at StripesMMPod. And if you have a tip or story idea, shoot us an email at militarymatters@stripes.com. And don't forget, you can get 50% off your digital subscription to Stars and Stripes today. Just use promo code PODCAST and get 50% off your digital subscription. That's promo code PODCAST. This episode is brought to you by Sabio, the #1 coding bootcamp for veterans. Visit sabio.la/military to learn more. Thank you for listening. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
And we'll see you at the next episode.